Hello, and I am delighted to have the chance to talk to Iain McGilchrist. Iain, hi there.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Look, you reached out, and I was very glad to respond to have a chance to talk through some of the troubles of our times, trying to make sense of some of them in the light of the two hemisphere hypothesis, for which you're now very well known and which so many people have found illuminating. But to try and think through some of the pressing concerns, things which it feels like we increasingly
Mm,
feel every day, in fact,
mm,
and
mm.
see what you've been developing, not just in the Master and His Emissary, but in The Matter with Things, your more recent book as well. And
Yes.
the themes around power and control, as you've
Mm,
put it very strongly, the sense that somehow life and nature is itself under attack, because of
yes.
things getting so out of kilter. So that
Mm,
broad area would be good to
mm.
explore.
Good.
Yeah, and
Yes.
and and
Well,
maybe touching on things like bureaucracy, tradition,
yes.
responsibility, a kind of range of areas that we do feel in our lives. And
Definitely. Yes.
okay,
Yes. And I think, of course, there is an area that is very immediate in everyday life and our experience, and there's an area that is perhaps more philosophical, but I'll try and bring them together. I've just come back from America, and it struck me again how much the culture there, and we get their culture a few years after after America has made use of them, how much the rhetoric of power is very important. I mean, even in rather amazing circumstances. So, for example, in the flat where I was staying, there was a toaster that was called a power toaster, and there was a power handheld Hoover, and there was a power whisk, and so on. Everything is sort of sexed up by adding the concept of power there. And it's a subject that's very much on my mind because of the astonishing growth in control in my lifetime, and particularly in the last perhaps 20 years. There seems a desire to be able to control things, which is curiously coupled with a feeling that people have of being more and more unable to influence the way things are going, a kind of impotence, which probably just intensifies the desire to feel that, yes, you've got a power toaster. Um, I'm more concerned, however, about the power invested in technology and bureaucracy.
yeah, I mean,
We,
it comes right home. I mean, and I guess it's a sell because it gives you the sense that somehow you're that bit more in control, in command of your life, even as you're
yeah,
making your toast in the morning. I mean, just
yeah,
just to begin to tease out the two
mm,
perspectives, side of that. I mean, as you talk about power, for example, it makes me aware that in the ancient Greek texts there are several words for power, and one
mm,
word is this sort of command, control power. Exousia is the word that's often used. It's the power of the patriarch on the family, or it's the power of not. It's not always bad. It's sometimes the power that does keep in order for good reason, but then it's power in the service of something other than itself. But there's a
yes,
second word, which is the word dunamis, which we do get the word dynamite from, but it's not actually explosive power. It's actually much more the power of allure, the power of
mm,
desire that wants that which is beautiful. I sometimes think of it as the kind of power of grace and space, expansiveness. And it feels like those two kinds of power are related to the two perspectives that you develop, um, that are part of our one consciousness. I don't know whether that
yes.
makes some sense to you.
Well, it certainly does because um, in my more recent book, particularly The Matter with Things, I talk about the inversion of values in our world, where the things that used to be considered incredibly important, the beautiful, the sacred, the good, the true, are now somewhere way down below the horizon that we're interested in, and everything has been replaced by a desire for pleasure and power, which in my view, in a properly functioning hierarchy of values, should be at the base, really. And there's nothing wrong with them in themselves, but they're things that are kind of dangerous if they take over our lives. So, yes, my thesis, as you know, is that the world is tending in the West, and now very, very much so in the East as well, towards a set of values served by the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is interested primarily in command and control. So, yes, to get slightly away from toasters, there's a very serious point that technology and administration work together to a situation where it may be that we can't actually extricate ourselves with dignity or freedom. What I mean by this is that technology is it's neither good nor bad, it's only as good as the people who are using it. But the difficulty is that in the modern world, those who are developing and exploiting the uses of technology are clearly those who are in power because they have either colossal amounts of money or are very high up in government or branches of administration. And who are those people? They're often perfectly decent people, I know, but there's a tendency for them to be interested in the excitements of power, and to have, perhaps in cases it's certainly been suggested, and I don't see that there's any reason to doubt it, that there is an excess of both psychopathic and narcissistic tendencies in those who congregate around power. The difficulty with having developed a technology which enables them effectively to enslave the people is that they will do. And it's about that I'm very concerned. Of course, the COVID situation has accelerated this in a number of ways. Very obviously, of course, because the mobile phone has somehow become a passport to being a full citizen, and that your rights as a citizen are controlled by things that you must carry on a phone, and you must have a pass, and it can track where you are, and this is reported, and so on. Now, I don't actually have a functioning mobile phone. I have one for emergencies when I'm traveling, but I don't like to be using it all the time because I think it has a toxic effect on the user. It fragments attention, it constantly interrupts, it simplifies things, it directs us, and it spies on us. Whether you know or whether people do know enough about what their phone stores, the information that it stores about them, I think people aren't generally aware of how much that is. What do you feel about that, Mark?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you use this powerful words in what you say there, like psychopathy, like being enslaved. And I think they're not necessarily inappropriate words, but maybe what you write about helps us to understand how these things can kind of creep up on us, rather than necessarily to be some kind of psychopath, in control, although it's not hard to imagine some parts of the world where that is the case, of course, which we're pretty aware of at the moment as well. But it's more this kind of creep that I think you capture so well. The bureaucracy that in one moment brings a kind of freedom through increased efficiency, that in the next moment loses the end to which it was originally intended, and so becomes an end in itself. And we almost forget, what life can be about. It's that kind of forgetting, mislaying, lacking the imagination that I think is as powerful as, say, the person designing the AI and making a world that suits the AI increasingly, and so
Yes.
excluding part of life that perhaps is the most important part in the process as well. It's these kind of unintended consequences that I think are so fascinating and in a way even more important to identify, because you can't just quickly, blame someone else or identify an evil figure. It's rising up from within us if we're not careful, as much as anything else.
Completely right. And that's a point I was proposing to come on to, which is a point that's been made for some time. It was made by Adorno back in the 40s and 50s, that it's not really to do with toxic individuals wanting to have power over us. That's often what's projected. At the moment, there's a general feeling that there's a group of individuals who are going to take over our lives. But very often, they are as much the victims of the process as the rest of us. Indeed, bureaucrats are themselves enmeshed in bureaucracy. It's not as though they're spared this. And once you fetishize a means, which may be administration or technology to an end, and make the thing matter whatever the end it reaches, then you've completely lost the plot. And that's where we're at the moment. I've been very struck by quite simple things. For example, I gave a talk to my university, Oxford University, about 7 months ago, and I didn't know that they were prepared to pay me for it. That was very nice. And in the past, I would very soon have had a check from the university chest. But in fact, it took 6 or 7 months of me filling in forms, looking at spreadsheets, which had nothing whatever to do with giving a lecture. They were designed for people who might be cleaning the windows around the university, literally. There were 71 categories, I think, but not one of them was giving a lecture, which I thought was the whole point of university. Now, I'm not wanting to, say anything about this experience, except that when I finally contacted the people who were trying to administer this, they said, oh, God, it's just a headache for us. It takes up so much of our time. And when you think of how expensive the time of all the people involved in this drama is and how many useless hours were used up, this is a terrifically wasteful process, at the very least. So I've noticed in the last 2 years that just doing something simple that used to take a 5-minute phone call can now take up to 4 hours on the internet, as something went wrong and then come back later and we need to check something, and they send no, but the code doesn't tally with the code they've got, and so on. And actually, if you live somewhere where there isn't a mobile phone, imagine what your life is like, because you can't validate these codes. So increasingly, things seem to take a very, very long time and be very much less human than they used to be. Another example, I met my son in London, and one of the striking things was, because I don't live in London, as you know, I live on a Scottish island, but was to see quite how many places in London where one could have met for a drink or to eat have closed down. That's one of the sad things about the COVID period. But the ones that were still working were, for reasons I'm sure they would justify on the grounds of this is what COVID brings, required you to order by scanning a QR code. So first of all, if you didn't have a mobile, which I didn't, you were capable of not only of going into a bar or restaurant because you couldn't validate your ID and your immune status, but you had to do this. And my son is very tech savvy. And it took 15 minutes for us to place an order. And in the end, he had to go to the bar and say, look, this process is breaking down. And I remembered, how much of my life I have really enjoyed going with a friend and going into a bar or restaurant, sitting down and talking, and somebody coming to the table and saying, oh, welcome, what can I do for you? And then you'd have a look at it and say, is this good? Yeah, it's very good indeed. It's got this and that and the other. Is it enough for 2 people? Or what would you do if you can't do that with a mobile phone. And gradually, contact with people is being phased out, of course, because people are expensive. But the machines actually we value your business, and because we care, and all this nonsense actually just covers up a situation in which life is degraded. It's becoming less human. It's becoming more difficult to accomplish any simple task. And at the higher level, you're being monitored, your movements and your health status, in a way that we would never have accepted a few years ago. So one of the very important messages for me is we must, all of us, fight back. So we must not rest until all the emergency procedures and rules and regulations that were brought in the early days of COVID are repealed. During the last war, there were various obligations on the population, obviously, and they were enforced by law. But at the end of the war, those were again repealed. Now, I worry that the lust for power and control was not even as exciting as lust. It's a sort of, as you were saying, it's something that everybody's caught up in and can't do anything about, even if they want to. But that kind of dynamism of control is such that we won't necessarily see this reverse. It's too useful for some government to have this data. But
So
imagine if there was an authoritarian government in control, like the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. It was possible in those days for people to go around distributing leaflets after dark, putting them in stairwells of blocks of flats and sort of pinning up notices. Nowadays, they wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, imagine trying to conduct some kind of counter government program in China.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know the world that you're talking about, and you know, there is the side of the kind of activism to repeal the laws. I also feel though that there's something can be understood here, which I know you'll know about as well. And in fact, as you were talking, a place came to my mind which was big in your past and has played a big role in my part, which is the Maudsley Hospital, the psychiatric hospital in South London, which we both worked at. And when I was there, I remember seeing a pattern which mirrors a lot of what you were saying, which was that money was allocated for mental health, but it was allocated in such a way that it had to be spent really quite quickly, you know, within, say, the cycle of a financial year. And that tended to mean that it was used to implement technology rather than train people, which takes many years and doesn't deliver the quick returns that can be measured and so on. But that sort of bureaucracy getting ahead of itself, you know, which you described. But the tragedy of the situation wasn't just that, you know, some bureaucrat higher up in the trust wanted more control. The tragedy was that there was a real desire to help people who are suffering, and a recognition, increasing recognition, that mental health is a huge problem in the modern world. But that desire misfired in the investing in the technology because of the pressure to do something, almost, you know, and this pressure was stoked up by the media, by celebrities, everybody in a way acting with the best will in the world, but with these increasingly inhuman outcomes, as you say. And so there's something to be understood about that in a way as well, that our desire to make things better can turn against us. And seeing how that happens feels really necessary to me as well as the activism, you know, the more clear cut, this must stop, which you describe as well.
Yes, I'm not just advocating, I'm not even really advocating activism in the way that word is normally used. What I mean is that we must be on our guard and fight back in our daily lives. For example, saying, you know, no, we don't like going to places where you don't have a waiter or waitress, you order through a QR code. But in any case, the overall point that you make very well is this point exactly, that this thing is bigger than us. It's not that there are all these evil-minded people trying to control us. I mean, there are a few, I'm certain of that, but they're in the minority. what the point I'm making is that there is a drive which is bigger than any one individual or group of individuals that pushes us in this direction. It somehow is the drive that in evolution made us have a very large part of our brain devoted to manipulation. And that is, largely speaking, what the left hemisphere of the brain is for. Not for truth seeking, not for understanding life and improving its quality, but having power and control, of which a little we all need. But then when it becomes hypertrophied, it takes over and strangles everything else. And what you described there is exactly right. However good people's intentions are, what happens is the money gets spent according to codes. And also it gets, above all, spent on administration and technology. You said, that technology is slightly sexy, oh, we've got the latest instruments. There was a wonderful satire on hospitals, the best that's ever been written. There was a series on television in the 90s called Cardiac Arrest. And in it, there was a sort of very clear distinction between doctors and nurses who are actually on the coalface dealing with patients, and the perfectly understandable points of view of, no doubt, very nice administrators and managers, which was utterly foreign to the professionals. And I've seen that just grow and grow in my lifetime. And of course, administration is enormously expensive. Trying to stop mistakes happen. You can spend as much money as you like, but they'll probably still happen. But lots of other things that you could have spent the money on much more positively won't be happening. So yes, I think that is right. And it reminds me of a couple of things. One is again, as I mentioned, people like Adorno saying that, our whole world is becoming, he used the word verwaltet, meaning sort of administered, die verwaltete Welt. And also it's beginning to lack life, that life itself is on the wane. And that's something I feel very, very strongly for a whole range of reasons. I mean, one, of course, is the rise of technology. Another is of this brain-dead administrative mentality, which replaces a mind that is live and where somebody has some power or control over their own place in the hierarchy. I mean, just trying to get anyone anymore to make a decision. They're also worried that they'll step out of line and get a black mark, that they don't. They refer it back up the hierarchy. This is the way the Soviet Union got fossilized. And as it fortunately seems, in Russia is still much less efficient than it might otherwise be, partly for these sort of reasons. But we've become a people who I think don't any longer value life for what it is. I think that what goes on in the sense of life is thin, is feeble, is waning because of our alienation from the natural world and our alienation from the body and its intuitions and instincts, which are extremely important. People who lose the ability to use their intuitive minds and their instincts become like people that you and I know. They're called schizophrenics, people with schizophrenia, who can only use logic. It's not that they've gone mad and lost their reason, as has been pointed out, I think, by G.K. Chesterton. It's not that they've lost their reason, it's they've lost everything else except reason. So they see something they don't understand, and they posit quite logically that must be beamed in from outer space or being done by the neighbors or so on. But they can't use their own intuitions and their previous knowledge from experience to say that's extremely unlikely.
Yeah, so look, let's unpick some of these concerns which you're raising there, like intuition, the approach to risk, the nature of freedom, and so on, because these feel like they're really important to more richly understand. And actually, just maybe as a way in there, you mentioned there that evolution's given us the left hemisphere and part of the need for survival. But as you very clearly explore a huge amount too, it's given us the right hemisphere, which broadly speaking, one could say is about making better contact with reality itself. not just
Exactly.
building the maps of the territory. And I feel that that's maybe a key part of what we need now. We need a big story that says, yeah, we're partly evolved to survive, but maybe more importantly, even we're evolved to know life, to participate in life, even to co-create with life itself. And that kind of story feels like it gets excluded from the scientific account. And then doubly so when the media picks it up, because the media tends to reduce things even more. And so retelling a story about who we are through our evolution. Yes. I mean, I've even used the phrase that we're Homo spiritualis as much as we're Homo sapiens, because I think that if you really look at the story of our evolution, of modern human evolution, you need to build in the sense of curiosity, enjoyment, imagination, engagement, that in a way was what was necessary to lead to, say, the development of tools, which were a kind of byproduct of that curiosity and engagement. Yes. You know, we're very used to the idea that technology appears almost overnight. But for most of human history, axes remained the same for millennia, say. And there must have been something else that kept people engaged with life beyond just the sheer need to improve their survival chances. And I think it was things like beauty, things like knowing not just of their own life, but of the whole ecology of life around and about them, and engaging with that, say, through ritual, through sharing in the seasons, through story and narrative telling. So this whole rich side of our humanity needs to come back, I think, and we need to tell a story about that once more. You're not, well, I guess that makes some sense then.
Of course it does. You know, that I endorse exactly that position. The purpose of writing The Matter with Things was to ask the question, who are we? Because I think that we've completely lost the plot. We imagine that we are these more or less inefficient mechanisms to do or achieve or grab whatever it is. And there's an infinite amount more to human life than that, as you say. So I'm completely in agreement there. Another point I think that's of interest is that we have had technology of a kind going back for thousands of years. Tools and fire and so on are all and using fire are all part of that. But it follows a very familiar path to me, which is that when there is a good point at which to stop pushing in a certain direction, that is something we absolutely don't understand anymore. We think that things are just linear, that if you keep on pushing in a certain direction, you'll achieve further and further distance from what you want to leave behind. But actually, unfortunately, space is curved, and mental space is curved, and time is curved. And what happens as you push is that you achieve the precise opposite of what it was you meant to achieve. So, as you say, there's a part of our brain that is devoted to helping us to survive. It's a bit of an irony that it's actually that part of the brain that is now making us effectively soon extinct. And along with us, many of the wonderful, vibrant, beautiful things of this earth. So being able to think more flexibly and to resist the tendencies of abstraction, map making, theorizing, mechanism, and come back to embodied knowledge, embodied experience, to listen to our intuitions. Perhaps I could just, gloss the thing on intuition a bit, because I think there's been an understandable desire to problematize intuition, and people like Dan Kahneman have, made a reputation out of it, which is fine. It's very entertaining, the illusions that he creates, where people intuitively think this, but the reality is different. But they're just like optical illusions. I can show you optical illusions where you say it can't be right, but it is. But after doing that, I never heard anybody say, gosh, well, in that case, I'm never going to use my eyes again. They're just going to deceive me. Our intuitions, most of the time, are extremely good and much more alive to what's going on, and much more able to blend in different relative amounts, concerns that are going on in our implicit understanding of the world and can't be expressed only in the explicit account that we give. As soon as we have to make an explicit account, we think only of a few simple words and a few simple thoughts. Whereas the implicit is where all the richness is going on, all that is we can contact through, as you mentioned, through poetry, through art, through the spiritual realm, through narrative, through indeed myths, which, as you know, there's nothing in the word myth that suggests that it's false. There may be false myths or there may be true myths. And in the modern age, we have a false myth, which is that we are the greatest asset the world has ever known, and we'll soon be able to control it in such a way that we'll be able to banish many of the evils that we have inherited. On the other hand, I believe that actually this very process, in its antagonism to life, in its antagonism to the spirit, in its antagonism to nature, can be considered in itself evil.
Well, look, I want to talk about evil, but maybe just first of all, just to put in this a slightly different way what you were just saying, because it strikes me that part of the problem actually is with psychology too. That psychology has tried to reduce the workings of the human mind, break it down so it can be tested in a sort of equivalent of a test tube. And that's when you get, well, on the one hand, these kind of psychological results that seem to say, you know, we're all deluded, because they're not joining up the whole of our psyche, but are just broadcasting one little result. But of course, the other thing that's occurred in psychology is this replication crisis, and where, because I think the mounting fragmented results of psychology, people aren't quite sure how to bring them all together, to link them all up, because there isn't a bigger ontology, a bigger metaphysics about who we are that can do that discerning and sorting. You get the replication crisis, where, you know, results that are true in one moment aren't true in the next because the conditions have changed. So they're so reliant on the reductive process. And I think there's been a parallel move in psychotherapy, actually, which is the bit of psychology that I know most directly, where originally Freud, said that we human beings are nothing if not projecting machines. Our kind of inner life is a continuous process of fantasy production that we then sort of project onto the world, and everything from God down is a sort of useful delusion for us. But it was corrected, particularly in the British traditions, by Donald Winnicott, who made a really interesting point, which I think connects with your sense of the value and importance of intuition, where he said, yeah, it's true, we do project, but our projections can land on reality. And when we feel they're grounded in reality, we feel reality speaking back to us, and we know ourselves to be more in the world, more connected, more participating in life. It's broadly the romantic intuition that goes back to Coleridge, that sheer fantasy might amuse us but doesn't really take us anywhere, where real imagination is productive. It aids our knowledge of the world, but also our enjoyment of life. It feels expansive of the soul. And so that dynamic where you know, a projection can go out, but when it makes contact with something that's real, it comes back to us as a rich intuition that can then be used to develop our worldview in all sorts of ways. And so I've really liked that kind of sense of, because it's also testable. You know, you can test it by feeling it in yourself, in your group, even in your society, when it makes for more humanity, makes for more life, the opposite of what is so worrying about our times now.
Yes, that's lovely. Again, as you know, because it comes very, very early on, like about page 8, I talk about my sort of ontology of the relationship between the way in which we receive the mind and the way we receive in our minds the world and how we create the world. But it's not that we're fantasizing, it's that we're contacting something that is speaking back to us. And the truth doesn't come from pursuing an abstract idea, but from testing out ideas on life. This is really the idea of the whole pragmatist tradition of philosophy, which I think has an enormous amount to be said for it. So yes, I think that's right. We certainly aren't just projecting. One of the things that goes on now is you get people saying, certain cognitive neuroscientists suggesting that somehow we're cut off from reality and all that we see is just a projection on a wall inside our heads. I take that position apart in the new book, and I think it's an extremely damaging idea. It's certainly true that we can be deceived, of course. We only ever have relative, more or less, access to what can be called in any sense true. But it doesn't follow that we don't make contact with reality at all and that reality means nothing. So, I mean, in fact, that's exactly the point of view. If you ask the left hemisphere, which is very self-referring, to work out what's going on when it's having experience. It say, oh, it's all inside, it's all in the theory like this, it's inside my head. So, yeah, we need to get beyond that vision. I think your point about replication, maybe you were meaning specifically about psychotherapy. Well, I mean, as you know, again, in the book, I talk about the strengths and weaknesses of science, and as somebody who relies very heavily on science, knowing enough about the strengths and the weaknesses of science is very important to me. And some of the weaknesses come from the institution of science itself. But one of the problems is, as you say, replication. I was fascinated to learn that actually the replication in cancer studies is considerably lower than that in psychology. In fact, replication in psychology is not one of the harder things in science to find. But you quite rightly point out, that when the context changes from the one that you're thinking about or looking at, then something new applies. And Iain Whitehead, another of the pantheon of philosophers that I greatly admire, said, the question is not, is this finding true or not, but in which circumstances will it prove to be true and in which circumstances will it not?
Yeah, look, I'm going to take you back to a big word which you mentioned a few minutes back that we must say more about, which is the word evil. I want to hear more about that. I mean, just as a first thought there, my sense is that it's an appropriate word again to raise in all this context because of the links that many at least have drawn between evil and ignorance, that one can meet actively, aggressively evil forces in life, but there's a wider notion of evil as well, which comes about from the ground up and unwittingly, because sight has been lost of what's good, beautiful and true. But I also know in your work that Hannah Arendt's thoughts on evil amplify something about this, huge concept again, which again, it's one that's used a lot in our times, and it's really good to understand quite what is meant. So, say something about Arendt's idea.
Well, as you rightly say, Hannah Arendt wrote more interestingly than most people about this problem, and being herself a fugitive from Nazi Germany who found refuge in America, she was in a position to talk about it. I think there's something very interesting in that point you make about there being sort of ignorance as part of evil. And when I talked to, I had a friend who escaped with her life from Ravensbrück concentration camp, and her whole story is completely fascinating, grueling, and terribly revealing. But one of the things she always said was that it wasn't really that people were so bad, it was aus bloßer Dummheit, out of sheer stupidity. And of course, one of the things that's said in defense of what happened in the Nazi machine, as we appropriately call it, is that it was carried out with bureaucratic efficiency, and that Hitler himself kept a bureaucratic distance from the realities that were going on. So getting back to reality is very important, but coming to evil, it again suggests to me, if there is evil, then it's something bigger than me. It's not something I've created. And therefore, it has an influence. And one of the ways in which it can gather influence is exactly by taking people who don't think that they have anything to do with the achievement of evil and using them to achieve it. So people who are, as you say, in a way, ignorant. I see things happening now in society where extreme points of view are pushed by people with enormous self-righteousness, that people who think more about them can see will possibly quite soon lead to terrible evils, to injustice, to harm, to inequality, to all the things that they think they are trying to get beyond. Again, it's this problem that when you push too far in one direction, you achieve what you're trying to run away from. So it's always very good to have skepticism about every point of view. And one of the things that is utterly wrong and quite possibly evil in this situation is the effective muzzling of people whose points of view are not those of those who make a loud noise on social media or whatever, and who have apparently taken over the universities. People are so terrified now of appearing to be somebody who could lose a job preferment or even find themselves up before a tribunal, that everyone is involved in a game which is really very bizarre. But anyway, what I'm saying there is that people can be quite quickly pushed by a very strong view on something to a place where it's said that it would be wrong for them even to have a doubt. And here I just mention another very interesting philosopher of the same period, another woman, who is Simone Weil, and she said, I think, very important words, that when we try to suppress doubt, we are creating evil. So the capacity to doubt, to question, to say, this sounds very black and white and adamant in this way you're expressing it, but what about another point of view? Have we thought about all the different aspects? So I think that, I mean, at times, of course, I maybe seem to be advocating, for example, the right hemisphere over the left. But in fact, we need both of these hemispheres to be operating. The story is more complicated. We need the right hemisphere to be the one that is in overall supervision of what the left hemisphere does, because when it goes it alone, when it thinks it knows everything, then things become badly wrong. And then I think one can talk about evil. Most of the evil things that we can think of in the last 150 years, things like Stalinism and Nazism and Maoism and Pol Pot and all these things, were done by people with an abstract ideology backed up by a huge bureaucracy and the latest technology. So we have now found ourselves in the so-called free world with something that is overtaking us faster than we know what to do about it. So you find people talking in the World Economic Forum, and you get people who ought to know better, philosophers like Harari, saying, well, this is what is going to be happening. There will be no free will. A human being is a hackable mechanism. Now, if we think like that, we will end up under the control of a tyranny that we can't throw off. There comes a point, once you're past that, you can't row back, because too much power will be in the hands of those who you're wanting to question. So it's very important that we don't slip inadvertently down that road, all the while thinking we're doing good, while actually encouraging a situation where life really will be given over, will be destroyed. It will be just mechanisms, and a mechanical being that is neither a proper human nor anything else that we know will be the legacy of humanity. And surely if there is evil, that is what an evil outcome would be.
Yeah, I mean, you're alluding perhaps in part there to the notion of transhumanism and the idea that we will perfect ourselves through increasingly merging with technology, be that procedural technology or electronic technology. I mean, the word always stands out to me because I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about Dante, and it's in the Divine Comedy that Dante coins the word transhumanism. But for him, it didn't mean working on our desires such as we understand them and trying to satisfy them. It meant precisely transcending ourselves to discover even more that we didn't even know was possible to appreciate and share in. And that feels to me part of the tragedy of now is that this promise of progress is actually a narrowing of our humanity. And because we've forgotten that we are capable of understanding more and more, approaching horizons, looking over them, and then seeing another horizon and so on, that requires us to change, not just manipulate the world to satisfy us as we exist now. That seems to me to be a key thing. It's a bit like, I often find this in words which were once religious words, like transhumanism, get secularized and then narrowed. I mean, another big one is the word enlightenment, which originally meant not being able to understand things with your own mind, but precisely transcending your own mind to understand the ground or origin, the wellspring of that mind. So when these things get reversed, I mean, you talk about the reversion of the values, of course, and maybe it resonates with that as well. But look, just to weave in something else, which you've touched on a few times, so I want you to say more about, which is the notion of freedom too. You mentioned free will there and freedom, and this feels to me to be another really key area to address and reimagine from the ground up again, because I mean, you mentioned what's going on in universities and the fear of what you might say and the reprimand you might receive and so on. And what strikes me about that is that the desire, again, maybe originally was good, because it was about making universities safe places. And that is still said, of course. But it's one of these things that can happen is that if you try to enforce safety through bureaucratic means, enabled by technology, you produce what Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst writing after the Second World War, very interestingly, given what you've been saying as well, called the fear of freedom. And this is the idea that our freedom to step into the unknown is too frightening. And so in the name of safety, people actually end up insisting on a reduction of their freedom in order that they won't face the risks of freedom. And I think that one of the things that's happened that has created this vicious spiral around freedom and safety and reduction and control and so on, is that we've forgotten that our freedom is for something else. We've got lots of free from, to use Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction, but we've forgotten what our freedom is for. And to bring in another kind of freedom, which Berlin referred to as well, which is that it's the freedom to align more and more with that which is more than ourselves, which is greater than ourselves, but which amplifies and satisfies us even as we join with it. To use the Platonic terms, it's that we're free to align with what's good, beautiful, and true. And when you just focus solely on the freedom from aspect of that and forget what your freedom is for, that's when you get the kind of collapse. So something about freedom and teasing that apart too, because it's such an important and misunderstood idea, as you're saying as well.
Yes, it's a very important issue, and we see being thrown away the right to speak freely, which has been fought for and achieved only in certain societies, and our ancestors shed blood and lost their lives in order to achieve a world in which it would be possible to speak freely, even if what you said wasn't agreeable to people. I mean, the basis of discussion is that it's possible to say things that the other person won't agree with at all and may be offended by. But we're, coupled to freedom is the idea that, yes, things can be achieved that some people may not like. So the desire to be safe is fine as long as it puts responsibility on you to keep yourself safe. But once you put the responsibility on other people to make the world safer around you, you've exported the responsibility. One of the things one has to do in the mental health world is to get people to take responsibility for their feelings, not to blame others for them. And to say that if you react that way and you feel that, then let's look at what you're doing to make that happen, because it's not going to be about changing someone else, it's going to be about changing you. That in itself points out that there needs to be a degree of discipline if there's going to be freedom. Everything has this relationship where opposites come to not contradict one another, but to complement one another. For there to be freedom, there needs some discipline. And if it's not us having self-control, then external controls, oppressive regimes will take over. So it's been fashionable during my lifetime to cast off most of the obligations, the duties, the self-controls that in my early years were thought to be rather important part of a sane society. And the price of throwing them off has been that dangers have loomed, and now people are saying, protect me, I don't like it. Well, that's not the adult posture, as you well know as a therapist. That is part of the problem that we're now getting. So how are we to do something about that? We must stop, I think, demanding that the world is made safe around us from things that are not really the very big threats. The very big threats are the threat to freedom, our freedom to move, our freedom to go, to act, to learn, to discuss. These are the things that make for a free society. As you say, freedom to go beyond the model that we have at the moment think is the acme of our wisdom. As I said earlier, technology is only as good as the people who have the power to use it. And what concerns me is there's nothing wrong with technology in itself, except that the transhumanism they're projecting is a fulfillment of the values of the people who are in a position to do this. And those values are, again, utility and increased pleasure, but they're not the increase of the freely good, beautiful, and true, which is where, and indeed you and I think, would agree to include there the sacred, that these things are part of enlightenment, understanding what they are rather than rejecting them because you actually don't understand them, is part of the process of education and of having a safe society.
Yeah, I mean, I have been persuaded by a critique that a lot of what can happen in these kind of discussions is a kind of moralizing, which is, I think, why in the culture wars it's often a sort of moralizing tone, and people are accused of being bad and so on. Morality is weaponized, and it's one thing to point that out and to try and prevent that in oneself when you spot it arising. But there's something deeper again about the world that's become, in a way, strangely become too moral. And what I mean by that is that, again, morality becomes a kind of end in itself. And so people are constantly judged on whether they're being good or bad. And it becomes a sort of zero-sum game and splitting into sides and tribes and so on. And what I feel's lost, actually, is an older tradition, again, which I know you know about, which is the virtue tradition, which actually says that the great thing about our habits, our qualities, our characteristics, who we are, is not actually whether we behave well or not, although that is a useful byproduct. What it's really about is how much we connect with reality. And the virtues that enable us to, say, be humble, is so that more and more of life might flow into us, so that we're less defended against life. You know, the virtue of love matters because we want to exceed our sense of ourselves now. And so are prepared to venture and be curious and these other virtues that follow in its wake. Someone who wrote really interestingly about this, I thought, was actually Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own, where she definitely argues that she needs a room of her own, and because she's a woman in her time, that was not readily available to her, to people like her as well. But what's also interesting in that essay is that she too writes about the need to reach a point where you don't just exist to protest against the world for what's gone wrong for you, but you do, as you were saying, come to a point where you can take responsibility for yourself. And she says that's the moment where the artistic spirit, the creative spirit, those virtues really come into their own, because interestingly now she has what she calls the androgynous mind that can say yes to the whole of life, allow all experiences to flow into her as a writer. And then her creativity really flies, because it's not about her and her protest, it's about representing, exploring, mirroring, capturing more and more of life. And so a figure like Shakespeare is really seminal for her here. And it's really significant that we know very little about Shakespeare, the person, because she says that he'd reached this point where he didn't have to exercise his own difficulties in life, which no doubt there were, but could say yes to the whole of life, and so transmit that to us, which is why it's, you know, so appealing to this day. So that's sort of a rather roundabout kind of way of saying that I think that when we think about ourselves and taking responsibility for ourselves so that we can embrace more and more of life, and that's the kind of qualities that we need, rather than saying yes to this and no to that. And, you know, there's a time for that, of course, because, you know, we need to feel safe as well. But so that we can step more into life and embrace more. There's something that feels really important, again, in our freedom to be able to do that.
And what you're illuminating is that for human flourishing, we need to take responsibilities and to allow things to come to us rather than being self-righteous. Again, there are many paradoxes around morality, but some people who think they're among the most righteous people are in fact very self-righteous. And one of the aspects of morality is the ability to have compassion and to forgive. In fact, all the things that were enjoined on us when we were growing up were presented as though they were actually about being good for other people, that they're very good for us. To forgive people, to let go of things, is as much about liberating oneself as anything else. So achieving a world in which we can talk with one another like adults again, not like anxious children. And, you know, we need to get back to that position, because if we don't, we will become infantilized by the powers that control our life, have the control now through bureaucracy and through technology, to take that control. And this is a tipping point. We've really got to be alert to this and do something to push it back. I would say yes, that great artists do exemplify this. It's a fascinating thing that's happened, is that most of the great artists of the past we know remarkably little about. But as you come closer to the modern time, you find that actually the person themselves is as much the work of art as anything they've produced. So they're sort of marketing themselves. The actual work of art may be something rather negligible. But there's a long screed about them and their thoughts and how it relates to it, which supposedly validates that work of art. And the same is true if it's, I'm not just meaning visual art, it could be music or whatever. But, you know, it's we need to, I think, find again a place where we understand the implicit in people, not these very simplified, explicit themes.
Yeah. Look, we've covered a lot of ground, and there was one other area which I think is really significant for our now that I wanted to put to you, and there may be other things that you want to add as well, but it's come to my mind partly because you're talking there about letting go and the person disappearing into their art, and it feels to me this is connected to the issue of death and dying, because in great wisdom and spiritual traditions, death is not just something to be avoided or get around or delay. It's not really that at all. It's much more seen as the way, because it's by letting go of oneself increasingly during life and then ultimately at the end of life, that one is able to discover more and more of life. And the fear of death that has arisen, I think, very much with the narrowing of the sense of what life is, the theme that in a way has run through all our conversation, has come very much to the fore, I think, in the COVID years. I'm involved with an organisation called Doctors in Distress, which is about the stress that has been heaped upon the medical profession even before COVID, but amplified since. And one of their analyses is that the whole of people's anxiety about death is now projected onto the medical profession with the expectation that it should be removed. And what gets lost is the other ways of thinking about our limits, about letting go, and ultimately about dying as well, that see that as part of the richness of life, in fact. You know, it's about receiving and giving, a related dynamic. And it felt to me like this would be something that you have to say about, not least in relation to the two hemispheres hypothesis, because it feels like the left kind of take on the world doesn't want to let go of what it's got, and because it sees that as the whole of life, whereas the right is constantly alert to the more that it might appreciate, and so disappears even in its experience and receipt of that more. So anyway, death feels like another really big issue that we need to get a handle on again, and old ways as much as modern concerns might help us with that.
I completely agree with that. And I think that one of the defining periods of our age is this attempt to thwart mortality, which of course is a battle that we can't win. And it wouldn't be good if we did, for a host of reasons that are obvious. For the planet, it wouldn't be a good thing, but it also wouldn't be good for us. And I remember reading a very interesting piece by a geriatrician saying that people feel when somebody dies young that there's been a great loss, and certainly in a way there has, but that actually living too long is also a great loss, as one's faculties change and the people that one loved are perhaps dying themselves. And I don't think any answer to that can be found in technology, because we'd have to completely reconstruct what a human being is. And if we did that, why would we want that kind of person to live forever? The kind of person whose main aim is just to carry on with whatever it is they're doing. That seems to show a complete lack of understanding of the nature of life, that death is built into it. There are limits to it. It's this refusal of limits, which is the defiant spirit of the left hemisphere. And you said it doesn't want to let go. I say in The Matter with Things that the left hemisphere's raison d'etre is to apprehend the world, literally to grasp it. And when the left hemisphere is disinhibited by a medical condition, patients start pointlessly grasping with their right hand, because this is the default mode of the left hemisphere. Whereas I like to contrast that with the right hemisphere's task, which is to comprehend, which means to take together rather than just to get at and take. And it's that we're in need of, is this broader vision of the world, of life, and of a human being. And I think that in that, I want to just say, because some people, they may have switched off already because we dared to talk about evil. But for those who are still with me and have worries about that, it's a long conversation one could have. And in brief, I think that the concept of evil can't be easily got round by just saying it's a way of describing things we find inconvenient or dislike. Again, you know as well as I do that's something we could talk about all day. But at the end of the day, I think that there is meaning in the idea of something that has a kind of dynamism of its own, and that is bigger than people or what they think they're aware of. And if you can agree that, then as far as I'm concerned, it's okay to call it evil. And it's certainly what Hannah Arendt called evil. And she famously talks about the banality of evil, which comes back to this idea that it's not sort of gruesomely psychopathic individuals somewhere. I mean, there may be some of those. There will be, I have no doubt of that. But it's far more about the general mass of us being caught up in a machine that is taking us somewhere that we don't want to go, and can actually do what should be described almost in biblical terms as the ultimate evil, which is to destroy God's creation. That's what we're actually doing. If you listen to the mythology of Christianity. And of course, Christ himself, in the Lord's Prayer, which is the most central piece of wisdom passed on by Christ for Christians, doesn't talk about us doing somewhat better than we might have otherwise done. He says quite specifically, deliver us from evil. And he himself, according to the Gospels, was tempted by evil. So I think it has a real meaning. And when one comes to think about the great debacle in history of the last 100 years, it isn't sufficient to talk about people could have done better and it was an absence of goodness and all this sort of thing. There was a drive there that was pushing in a certain direction. And all I would say is that right now, whatever you want to call it, there is a drive that is pushing us somewhere that we're not sufficiently aware of. And if we're pushed much further down that path, we won't be able to come back from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very useful to recognize the seriousness of our times, but also that is the opportunity for our times as well. You know, it's calling much from us in response to the much that's happening, and you know, that's why I think that your work, your books, your discussions are so valuable to our times, because they enable us to respond, partly by the analysis, but then also by the remembrance that there's so much more as well. I'm reminded a bit of Dante again. One of the great reveals in the Inferno, the place where evil actively seizes control, as you say, is that the way out of the Inferno is actually approaching Lucifer right at the floor of hell, frozen so solid that they've almost fallen out of existence altogether. But the way out is right on the body of Lucifer, clambering down his side, and then comes the turnaround. And I think that one of the insights there is that it's by taking this understanding, this insight right into the heart of the darkness, that the turnaround can start to happen. And you know, I think that for me anyway, that's one of the things which reading and reflecting on your work enables us to do. There is evil, but there's always more as well. And sensing the light that returns even as you try to understand the evil, I think is a really important dynamic to hold on to.
I mean, that whole vision of being able to get out of hell only by crossing the body of Lucifer. You're absolutely right, is a very powerful image. And as you know, in The Matter with Things, I have a whole chapter on the coincidence of opposites. And in a way, one of the important insights of Jung is what he called enantiodroma, which is the idea that by going in a direction where we think we're achieving good, we may achieve bad. And by going in a direction that may look bad, we may achieve good. It's actually a point that's also made by Goethe in Faust, very, very clearly. So, and that, I think, speaks to us at this time. So being able to move on, I think, is the key message. And you're right, that I do suggest a way forward, but it begins in awareness, as it begins for my patients and yours. We get people to move in a creative and a benign direction by raising their awareness of both where they are, who they are, and what it is they want to put in its place. And unless we're able to have a vision of what a human being can be and what a human being actually is, we're stuck. Because if we buy this idea that we can only somehow better ourselves by becoming partly mechanical, we really are doing the undoing of humanity, achieving the undoing of humanity.
Yeah, it's the loss of, you mentioned the word in passing, but you're absolutely right, it's central for me as well. It's the loss of the sacred, which, whatever else it might mean, is that which our life longs for and is in the service of, and finds its rationale within as well, however it's conceived, be that in terms of God or otherwise. The mechanical narrowing of life, driven by utility and the grasping, as you describe, well, doesn't just forget, but would even actively dismiss, another kind of evil. But there is always more, and it's right that this relationship between left and right is asymmetric, as you discuss much as well, and what's in the service of what is completely crucial. So look,
crucial.
Yeah, I hope that for listeners, that our conversation has helped tease some of that out, understand these dynamics, so that you can feel more. That's part of the therapeutic task, in a way. You can sense the space and not just feel trapped and confined, even in periods of crisis. So thanks so much, Iain. I've really appreciated the chance to air some of these things with you.
Thank you, Mark, too. That's been a good conversation. Thank you very much.